My name is Sarah Mitchell, and 3 weeks ago I stood in a cemetery watching them lower my ex-husband's casket into the ground, thinking I'd finally closed the book on the most painful chapter of my life. I had no idea that David had left me $10 million in the most twisted, brilliant way imaginable, or that his final gift would destroy his precious new family and give me the revenge I never knew I needed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a man I thought I hated became the architect of my ultimate vindication from beyond the grave. 6 months ago, I was just another divorced woman in suburban Phoenix, working double shifts as a nurse practitioner to make ends meet while my ex-husband David lived in luxury with his new wife Melissa and her two spoiled teenagers. We'd been divorced for 3 years, and those 3 years had been a masterclass in humiliation. David, who'd been a struggling accountant when we married 15 years earlier, had somehow built a multi-million-dollar financial consulting firm after our divorce. Meanwhile, I was clipping coupons and driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a rattling exhaust pipe. The irony wasn't lost on me. During our marriage, I'd worked nights at the hospital to put David through his MBA program. I'd sacrificed my own dreams of becoming a physician, settling for my nurse practitioner degree so I could support us while he built his career. I'd believed in us, in him, in the future we were supposed to build together. What I got instead was divorce papers on our 15th wedding anniversary and the devastating revelation that he'd been having an affair with Melissa, a wealthy widow with connections that would help his business flourish. I remember the day I signed those divorce papers like it was yesterday. David sat across from me at his lawyer's polished conference table, looking uncomfortable but determined. His attorney, a sharp-dressed shark named Gregory Walsh, slid the settlement papers across the mahogany surface with practiced indifference. I was getting the house, which still had a mortgage larger than its current value, our modest savings account, and a monthly alimony payment that barely covered my car insurance. David was keeping his business, his new luxury car, and apparently his freedom to marry Melissa 6 months later in a ceremony that cost more than our entire wedding. "This is fair, Sarah," David had said, avoiding my eyes. "The business is mostly potential at this point. I'm taking on significant debt to keep it running." Fair. The word echoed in my head for months afterward. Fair was me working 16-hour shifts while he networked at country clubs. Fair was me eating ramen noodles while he took Melissa to Paris for their honeymoon. Fair was watching him build an empire on the foundation I'd helped create, then being told I deserved crumbs from the table. But I signed those papers anyway because I was exhausted. Exhausted from fighting, exhausted from trying to save a marriage to a man who'd already moved on, exhausted from the constant stress of wondering when the other shoe would drop. I just wanted it to be over. What I didn't know then was that David had been planning something else entirely, something that would take 3 years to come to fruition and would change everything I thought I knew about my ex-husband, my divorce, and my future. The first sign that something was different came 2 months before David's death, though I didn't recognize it at the time. I was working a particularly brutal Thursday night shift in the ICU when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was simple: "You deserve better." I stared at the screen, confused. David and I hadn't spoken directly in over a year, communicating only through lawyers when absolutely necessary. Our last conversation had been about selling the house, which I'd finally done 6 months earlier, moving into a small apartment across town. He'd seemed almost sad during that call, asking if I was okay, if I needed anything. I'd been cold, professional. I didn't want his pity. Now this cryptic message. I almost replied, almost asked what he meant, but pride held me back. Instead, I deleted the text and went back to checking on my patients, pushing the strange message out of my mind. The second sign came a month later. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, knocked on my apartment door on a Saturday morning with a concerned expression. "Sarah, dear," she said, wringing her hands, "there was a man asking questions about you yesterday." Well-dressed fellow said he was from some kind of financial firm. He wanted to know about your work schedule, whether you lived alone, that sort of thing. I didn't tell him anything, of course, but it seemed odd. A chill ran down my spine. What did he look like? Tall, thin, expensive suit, had a briefcase, very professional, but something about him made me uncomfortable. He said it was about some kind of inheritance verification, but that doesn't sound right to me. I assured Mrs. Patterson that it was probably nothing, maybe related to my late father's estate, though that had been settled years ago. But the incident troubled me. Who would be investigating me and why? The third and final sign came just 2 weeks before David's death. I was leaving the hospital after another long shift when I noticed a black sedan following me. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but the car stayed behind me through several turns, maintaining a careful distance. When I pulled into a gas station to see if my suspicions were correct, the sedan drove past without stopping, but not before I caught a glimpse of the driver. It was the same man Mrs. Patterson had described, tall and thin in an expensive suit. I sat in my car at that gas station for 20 minutes, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what was happening. The logical part of my brain said I was overreacting, that it was probably nothing. But something deeper, some instinct I'd learned to trust during my years in healthcare, told me that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't yet imagine. I never found out who that man was or why he was watching me because 2 weeks later, David was dead. The call came at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning. I was getting ready for work, sipping my coffee and reviewing patient charts when my phone rang. The number was familiar but unexpected, David's business partner, Marcus Rodriguez. "Sarah, I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you this," Marcus said, his voice shaky. "David had a heart attack last night. He didn't make it." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank into my kitchen chair, the phone pressed to my ear, trying to process what I'd just heard. David was only 42 years old. He'd been in good health as far as I knew. How could he just be gone? "What happened?" I whispered. "He was working late at the office," Marcus explained. "Cleaning lady found him this morning. Paramedics said it was massive, probably instantaneous. Sarah, I know things were complicated between you two, but I thought you should know." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the wall and feeling nothing. Not grief, not relief, just a strange emptiness. David had been such a central figure in my life for so long, first as my husband, then as the source of my pain and anger. The idea that he simply no longer existed seemed impossible to comprehend. I called in sick to work and spent the day in a fog, alternating between memories of our good times and the bitter reality of how it had all ended. I found myself looking through old photo albums, seeing the young couple we'd been, so hopeful and in love. It felt like looking at strangers. The funeral was scheduled for Friday, and I debated whether to attend. We'd been divorced for 3 years, and I hadn't spoken to David in over a year. Melissa would be there with her family, and I wasn't sure I could handle the awkwardness and the inevitable whispers, but something compelled me to go, perhaps a need for closure I hadn't known I was seeking. The service was held at St. Michael's Cathedral downtown, a massive stone structure that seemed far too grand for the man I'd known. David had never been particularly religious, but Melissa apparently had different ideas about how to send him off. I arrived early and slipped into a pew near the back, hoping to remain unnoticed. The cathedral filled quickly. I was surprised by how many people came to pay their respects. David had always been charming and well-liked, but I hadn't realized how large his professional network had become. Business associates, clients, neighbors from his upscale community, all dressed in expensive black and speaking in hushed, reverent tones. Melissa sat in the front row with her 2 teenagers, playing the grieving widow to perfection. She wore a tailored black dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and her makeup was flawless despite the tears that seemed to come and go at precisely the right moments. Her children, Emma and Tyler, both looked appropriately somber, though I caught Tyler checking his phone during the opening prayer. The service itself was what you'd expect, generic platitudes about David's success, his generosity, his love for his family. Several business associates spoke about his innovative approaches to financial planning and his mentorship of younger colleagues. Melissa gave a tearful eulogy about their love story and how David had brought joy back into her life after her first husband's death. I listened to it all with growing irritation. They were talking about a man I didn't recognize, painting him as some kind of saint. Where was the mention of his first wife who'd supported him through school? Where was the acknowledgement of the sacrifices others had made for his success? It was as if our 15-year marriage had been erased from his history. As the service concluded and people began filing out to their cars for the procession to the cemetery, I considered leaving. I'd paid my respects, satisfied my need for closure, but as I stood to go, someone touched my shoulder. Sarah Mitchell." I turned to see a woman about my age, professionally dressed with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair. She looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place her. "I'm Jennifer Walsh," she said, extending her hand. "I work at David's firm." "He spoke about you often." I shook her hand, confused. "He did? Oh yes, he was very proud of your work at the hospital. He used to say that you saved more lives in a week than he helped in a year." She paused, studying my face. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you planning to attend the burial?" "I hadn't decided," I admitted. Jennifer glanced around, then leaned closer. "I think you should come. There's something David wanted you to know, and today might be your only chance to learn about it." Before I could ask what she meant, she'd melted back into the crowd, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. What could David possibly have wanted me to know? And why was this woman being so cryptic about it? Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the procession to Phoenix Memorial Gardens. The burial site was on a hill overlooking the valley, with a view of the mountains in the distance. It was the kind of place that cost a fortune, all manicured lawns and granite headstones, a far cry from the modest cemetery where my own parents were buried. The graveside service was mercifully brief. The priest spoke about resurrection and eternal peace while the late October wind whipped through the desert, making everyone clutch their jackets tighter. Melissa stood at the head of the casket, surrounded by her family and closest friends, while the rest of us formed a loose semicircle around the burial site. I positioned myself near the back again, partly out of respect for the family's grief and partly because I still wasn't sure why I was there. But as the priest concluded his remarks and people began to drift away, I noticed something odd. Several people were approaching me, people I didn't recognize, offering condolences as if I were family. David spoke of you often, said an elderly man in an immaculate suit. He was very proud of your accomplishments. You were such an important part of his life, added a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. He never forgot what you did for him. These comments bewildered me. If David had been proud of me, if I'd been important to him, why had he treated me so coldly during the divorce? Why had he cut me out of his life so completely? As the crowd thinned, I found myself standing alone by the graveside, staring down at the casket that would soon be covered with earth. Whatever secrets David had been keeping, whatever Jennifer Walsh had been hinting at, they would be buried with him. I felt a profound sense of loss, not just for the man who died, but for all the words that would never be spoken, all the explanations that would never come. Mrs. Mitchell. I turned to see a man in a dark suit approaching. He was tall and thin, and with a start I recognized him as the same man Mrs. Patterson had described, the one who'd been asking questions about me, possibly even following me. "I'm Thomas Bradley," he said, extending a business card. "I'm an attorney with Bradley, Stevens & Associates. I represent your late husband's estate." My hands trembled slightly as I took the card. "I don't understand. David and I were divorced." "I have no claim on his estate." Thomas Bradley smiled, and there was something almost conspiratorial in his expression. "That's where you're wrong, Mrs. Mitchell. Your ex-husband left very specific instructions regarding your inheritance. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the details if you're amenable." My inheritance? The words felt foreign in my mouth. What inheritance? David left everything to Melissa. "Not everything," Bradley said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "There are certain assets that were specifically designated for you, assets that Mrs. Whitman knows nothing about." I felt dizzy. This couldn't be real. David had made it clear during our divorce that I was entitled to nothing beyond what was spelled out in our settlement agreement. The idea that he'd secretly left me something seemed impossible. "I don't understand," I repeated weakly. "Your ex-husband was a very complex man, Mrs. Mitchell, much more complex than most people realized. He spent considerable time and effort ensuring that certain aspects of his estate would be handled according to his wishes, not necessarily according to his public will." Bradley handed me another card, this one with an address. "Can you meet me at my office tomorrow at 2 o'clock? I think you'll find our conversation quite illuminating." With that, he walked away, leaving me standing by David's grave with my mind reeling. What kind of game had my ex-husband been playing? And why did I have the feeling that his death was just the beginning of something much larger and more complicated than I could imagine? That night, I barely slept. I kept turning Bradley's words over in my mind, trying to make sense of them. David had been secretive toward the end of our marriage. I remembered that now. He'd started working longer hours, making phone calls he'd end abruptly when I entered the room, taking business trips to cities where I later learned he had no clients. At the time, I'd attributed it all to the affair, to his growing distance from our marriage. But what if there had been something else going on? I thought about those strange text messages, the man following me, Jennifer Walsh's cryptic comments at the funeral. Had David been planning something all along? And if so, what? The next day dragged by with agonizing slowness. I tried to focus on my patients, to lose myself in the routine of hospital work, but my mind kept wandering to the appointment ahead. By the time 2 o'clock arrived, I was a bundle of nervous energy. Bradley, Stevens & Associates occupied the entire 42nd floor of one of Phoenix's most prestigious high-rises. The reception area was all marble and mahogany, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a spectacular view of the valley below. It was the kind of place that screamed money and power, the kind of place I'd never had reason to visit before. Thomas Bradley met me in the lobby personally, which seemed unusual for a man who was clearly a senior partner. He led me to a conference room that was larger than my entire apartment, with a polished table that could seat 20 people and walls lined with legal volumes. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat. "Can I offer you coffee, water?" I declined, wanting to get straight to the point. "Mr. Bradley, I have to be honest with you. I'm completely confused about why I'm here. David and I were divorced 3 years ago. Our settlement was final. I can't imagine what he could have left me." Bradley opened a thick folder and removed several documents. "Your confusion is understandable, Mrs. Mitchell. What I'm about to tell you will probably come as quite a shock." He paused, studying my face. "Did you know that your ex-husband had been planning your inheritance for almost 2 years before his death?" "That's impossible," I said flatly. "David barely spoke to me after our divorce. He certainly never mentioned anything about leaving me money." "No, I imagine he didn't. David was very clear that you were not to know about any of this until after his death. He wanted it to be, in his words, a complete surprise." Bradley opened one of the documents and turned it toward me. "Mrs. Mitchell, your ex-husband has left you $10 million. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the legal document, seeing my name clearly typed next to an amount that seemed impossible to comprehend. $10 million, more money than I'd ever dreamed of having, more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. "This can't be real," I whispered. "I assure you it's very real, but there's more." Bradley pulled out another document. "Money isn't coming from David's primary estate, the one that Mrs. Whitman will inherit. It's coming from a separate trust that David established specifically for you, funded through a series of very sophisticated financial instruments that he set up over the past 2 years. I looked up from the documents, my head spinning. I don't understand. How could he have that much money to give away without Melissa knowing about it? Bradley smiled grimly. That's where things get interesting, Mrs. Mitchell. Your ex-husband was far more successful than anyone realized, including his current wife. The business she knows about, Mitchell Financial Consulting, is worth approximately $8 million, but David had other investments, other income streams that he kept completely separate. The trust fund he established for you is worth $10 million, but it represents only a portion of his hidden assets. Hidden assets? I felt like I was in some kind of surreal dream. Are you telling me David was hiding money from his wife? Not hiding exactly, more like compartmentalizing. David was very specific about wanting to provide for you in a way that would honor the sacrifices you made during your marriage. He felt that the original divorce settlement was, and I quote, a grave injustice that needed to be corrected. I leaned back in my chair, overwhelmed. The David that Bradley was describing seemed like a completely different person from the man who'd handed me divorce papers and watched me sign away my claim to his future success. But why didn't he just give me a better settlement during the divorce? I asked. Why all this secrecy and complexity? Bradley's expression grew serious. Because, Mrs. Mitchell, David discovered some things about his new wife after your divorce was finalized that changed his perspective considerably. Things that made him realize he'd made some very serious mistakes, both in how he ended your marriage and in who he chose to marry next. What kind of things? That's where this story becomes even more complicated. Bradley pulled out a third set of documents. About 6 months after David married Melissa, he discovered that she had been manipulating him from the very beginning. She'd researched his background, learned about his business potential, and deliberately positioned herself to meet him. The affair that ended your marriage wasn't a chance encounter or a moment of weakness. It was a calculated seduction designed to separate David from his assets. I felt sick. You're saying she targeted him? That's exactly what I'm saying. David hired a private investigator to look into Melissa's background after some financial discrepancies came to light. What he found was disturbing. Melissa's first husband hadn't died of natural causes, as she claimed. He'd committed suicide after discovering that she'd been systematically draining their joint accounts and having an affair with his business partner. There was an investigation, but no charges were filed due to lack of evidence. The room felt like it was spinning. I gripped the edge of the conference table, trying to process what I was hearing. David knew all this and stayed married to her. David was trapped, Mrs. Mitchell. By the time he learned the truth about Melissa, they'd been married for almost a year. His business had become intertwined with her family connections. More importantly, she'd made it clear that if he tried to leave her, she'd destroy him professionally and personally. She had access to his accounts, his business records, his client lists. She could have ruined him. So he stayed in a marriage with a woman he knew was dangerous. He stayed, but he also started planning. David spent the last 2 years of his life carefully extracting his assets from anything Melissa could touch, setting up the trust for you, and documenting everything he'd learned about his wife's true nature. Bradley opened another folder, this one thicker than the others. This contains copies of everything David compiled about Melissa. Financial records, private investigator reports, recorded conversations. He wanted you to have it all. I stared at the folder, afraid to touch it. Why me? Why not just expose her himself? Because David knew that Melissa would never let him live long enough to reveal what he discovered. He was genuinely afraid for his life, Mrs. Mitchell. That's why he had you followed by security personnel for the past few months. He was trying to protect you in case she figured out what he was planning. The man I'd thought was stalking me had been protecting me. The realization made me feel even more disoriented. Are you suggesting that Melissa killed David? Bradley's expression was carefully neutral. I'm not suggesting anything that could constitute a legal accusation. What I will say is that David's will contains very specific instructions about what should happen if his death appears suspicious in any way. He's left you not just the money, Mrs. Mitchell, but also the power to expose everything he discovered about his wife. I opened the thick folder with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of documents, bank statements showing large transfers from accounts I'd never heard of, photographs of Melissa meeting with unknown men in hotel lobbies, transcripts of recorded phone conversations where she discussed David's business with people she claimed not to know. The evidence painted a picture of a woman who was far more calculating and dangerous than I'd ever imagined. What am I supposed to do with all this? I asked. That's entirely up to you, Bradley replied. David's instructions were clear. You're to receive the inheritance and the information, but how you choose to use both is your decision. However, I should mention that there are time-sensitive elements to consider. What do you mean? Melissa doesn't know about the separate trust yet, but she will soon. David's primary will is being read next week, and there are references to assets that don't match what she expects to inherit. She's going to start asking questions, and when she does, she's going to discover that a significant amount of money has gone to you. I felt a chill run down my spine. What will she do when she finds out? based on David's research into her past behavior, probably try to challenge the inheritance legally. She'll claim that David wasn't of sound mind when he established the trust, or that you somehow manipulated him into leaving you the money. She has lawyers, Mrs. Mitchell, very expensive ones, and she's not above using intimidation or worse to get what she wants. The implications of what he was saying hit me like a freight train. I wasn't just inheriting money, I was inheriting a war with a woman who might have killed her first husband and possibly my ex-husband as well. I need time to think about this, I said, standing up from the conference table on unsteady legs. Of course. Mrs. Mitchell, there's one more thing you should know. Bradley's voice was gentle but firm. David was very specific about this. He said that if anything happened to him, you were the only person he trusted to make sure justice was served. He believed that you, more than anyone, would understand the importance of exposing the truth. I left the law office in a daze, clutching the folder full of evidence against Melissa and trying to wrap my mind around the idea that I was now worth $10 million. But more than the money, more than the shock of David's revelations, I was struck by something else. For the first time in years, I felt like I had power. That evening, I sat in my small apartment with the folders spread across my kitchen table, reading through document after document. The picture that emerged was of a woman who was part con artist, part predator. Melissa had been married 3 times before David, and each marriage had ended with her significantly wealthier than when it began. Her first husband's suicide hadn't been investigated thoroughly because local police had been influenced by her family's political connections. Her second husband had died in what was ruled an accidental fall, but there had been a significant life insurance payout. Her third husband had simply disappeared, leaving behind debts and a missing persons case that had gone cold. David had been her 4th victim, but unlike the others, he'd figured out her game before it was too late. The private investigators' reports revealed that Melissa had been planning to leave David within the next year, taking half his assets in a divorce settlement and disappearing like she had before. David's sudden death had simply accelerated her timeline. As I read through the evidence, I began to understand why David had chosen me to inherit this responsibility. I was the one person who knew him well enough to recognize the truth in these documents, who had reason to want justice for what Melissa had done to both of us. But more than that, I was someone she would underestimate, someone she'd see as just another victim to be manipulated or intimidated. She had no idea what she was dealing with. The reading of David's primary will took place the following Tuesday at the offices of Gregory Walsh, the same lawyer who had handled our divorce. I wasn't invited, of course, but Thomas Bradley had arranged for me to receive a copy of the proceedings. According to the transcript, everything had gone smoothly until the executor reached the section about asset distribution. Melissa had been expecting to inherit David's entire estate, the business, the house, the investment accounts, everything. What she discovered instead was that several major assets had been transferred out of the estate before David's death. The business was still hers, along with the house and cars, but nearly $15 million in various investments and accounts had been moved into what the will described only as a private trust established for the benefit of parties designated by the deceased. According to Bradley's sources in the room, Melissa had gone white when she heard those words. She demanded to know what trust, who the beneficiaries were, and why she hadn't been informed. Gregory Walsh had explained that he knew nothing about any separate trust, that it must have been handled by another attorney. The meeting had ended with Melissa storming out, threatening to challenge anything that reduced her inheritance. It took her exactly 3 days to figure out that I was the primary beneficiary of David's secret trust. I knew she'd found out because at 6:15 on Friday morning, my apartment buzzer rang insistently. And I looked through the peephole. Melissa was standing in my hallway, dressed in an expensive black coat and looking like she was ready for war. I considered not answering, but something told me this confrontation was inevitable. Better to face it on my terms than let her choose the time and place. I opened the door but kept the chain lock engaged. "We need to talk," Melissa said without preamble. Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "About what?" "About the money you stole from my husband's estate." I almost laughed at the audacity of the accusation. Here was a woman who had manipulated David into marriage, isolated him from his family and friends, and possibly killed him, accusing me of theft. "I didn't steal anything, Melissa. David left me an inheritance. There's a difference. David was sick when he made that trust. He wasn't thinking clearly. Any judge will see that a $10 million gift to an ex-wife is evidence of mental incapacity, so she knew the amount. That meant she'd been doing her own investigation, probably using the same private detectives she'd employed to research David's background years earlier. "David seemed perfectly capable of making his own decisions to me," I replied calmly, "but I suppose you know more about his mental state than anyone. After all, you lived with him." Something flickered in Melissa's eyes, a flash of something cold and calculating. "Sarah, let's be reasonable about this. You and I both know that David left you that money out of guilt, not because you deserve it. He felt bad about how your marriage ended, so he made an impulsive gesture that he would have regretted if he'd lived longer. That's an interesting theory, It's not a theory, it's fact. And here's another fact. I'm going to challenge that trust in court. I have lawyers who specialize in estate disputes, and they're very, very good at what they do. You're going to spend the next 5 years fighting me, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees, and in the end, you'll lose everything. I could hear the threat in her voice, but there was something else too, desperation. Melissa needed that money for something, needed it badly enough to show up at my apartment at dawn to try to intimidate me into giving it up. Unless, I prompted, unless we make a deal. You give me $8 million, keep 2 for yourself, and we both walk away happy. You'll still have more money than you've ever dreamed of, and I won't have to destroy you in court. I pretended to consider the offer while I studied Melissa's face. She was beautiful, I had to admit, even in her anger. Perfect makeup despite the early hour, not a hair out of place, clothes that probably cost more than my monthly salary. But there was something brittle about her perfection, something that suggested it was all a carefully constructed facade. That's generous of you, I said finally. But I think I'll keep what David left me. Melissa's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw the fury underneath. You're making a mistake, Sarah, a very serious mistake. I tried to be reasonable, but if you want to do this the hard way, we can do this the hard way. Is that a threat? It's a promise. I will take everything from you, and when I'm done, you'll wish you'd taken my offer. With that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the concrete like gunshots. I watched her go, my heart pounding but my resolve strengthening. Melissa thought she was dealing with the same broken, defeated woman who'd signed those divorce papers 3 years ago. She had no idea how much I'd changed or how much I was about to change. That afternoon, I called Thomas Bradley and scheduled another meeting. It was time to stop being reactive and start being strategic. If Melissa wanted a war, I was going to give her one, but it would be fought on my terms. She offered me a deal, I told Bradley when we met. Keep $2 million, give her 8. Bradley nodded grimly. That's actually better than I expected. She must be desperate for cash flow. Why would she be desperate? She inherited the business and the house. The business is worth $8 million on paper, but it's not very liquid. She can't just sell it overnight, especially not in the current market. And the house, while valuable, is mortgaged to the hilt. David was carrying significant debt to maintain their lifestyle and expand the business. So she needs my $10 million to cover her expenses. It's more than that. Bradley pulled out another folder. I've been doing some investigating of my own since our last meeting. Melissa has some debts that David probably didn't know about. Credit cards, personal loans, money owed to some very unsavory people. What kind of unsavory people? The kind who charge interest rates that would make a loan shark blush and who don't accept "I need more time" as an answer. Bradley's expression was serious. Mrs. Mitchell, I think Melissa is in real financial trouble, the kind that might explain why she's been so aggressive about getting control of David's assets. This information changed everything. If Melissa was desperate for money, it meant she might be willing to take desperate action to get it. But it also meant she was vulnerable in ways I was only beginning to understand. What do you think I should do? That depends on what you want to accomplish. If you just want to keep your inheritance and avoid conflict, you could probably negotiate some kind of settlement with her. Give her half, keep half, and hope she leaves you alone. And if I want to expose what she did to David, Bradley was quiet for a long moment, then you need to be prepared for her to try to destroy you. Melissa doesn't fight fair, and she doesn't show mercy to people who threaten her. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of battle? I thought about David, about the years I'd spent supporting his dreams only to be discarded when someone more useful came along. I thought about the guilt I'd carried for 3 years, wondering if I could have fought harder for our marriage, if I could have been a better wife. Now I knew the truth. Our marriage had been doomed from the moment Melissa decided she wanted David for herself. I'm ready, I said. The first shot in my war against Melissa came 2 weeks later, and it wasn't fired by her lawyers as I'd expected. Instead, it came in the form of a phone call at 3 a.m. from Phoenix Police Department. Mrs. Mitchell, this is Detective Rodriguez with Phoenix PD. I'm calling about a break-in at your apartment. I sat up in bed, instantly awake. What break-in? I'm in my apartment right now. Ma'am, are you at 1247 Desert Vista Drive, apartment 3B? That was my old address, the apartment I'd moved out of 2 months earlier when I'd finally saved enough money to upgrade to a slightly larger place across town. No, I moved out of that apartment in September. Why? The current tenant reported a break-in around midnight. The intruders seemed to be looking for something specific, tore the place apart, but didn't take any electronics or jewelry. When we ran the previous tenant records, your name came up as the most recent occupant. I felt cold dread spreading through my chest. Did they find whatever they were looking for? That's what we're trying to determine. The current tenant says nothing appears to be missing, but the apartment was thoroughly searched, drawers emptied, mattresses overturned, even the refrigerator was moved away from the wall. Whoever did this was looking for something they thought might be hidden. After I hung up with the detective, I sat in my darkened bedroom trying to process what had happened. Someone had broken into my old apartment looking for something they thought I might have hidden there. The The timing, just 2 weeks after my confrontation with Melissa, couldn't be a coincidence. But what had they been looking for? I'd taken everything of value when I moved, and I'd never hidden anything in that apartment anyway. Unless they were looking for David's evidence. The next morning, I called Thomas Bradley and told him about the break-in. His reaction confirmed my suspicions. They were looking for the documents, he said grimly. Melissa must have figured out that David left you more than just money. But how would she know? David's computer. She's had access to it since his death, and she's probably been going through his files. If she found any reference to the private investigator or the evidence he compiled, she'd know you were a threat to her. So what do I do now? First, you make sure those documents are secure. I recommend a safety deposit box at a bank she has no connection to. Second, you consider whether you want to involve the police in David's death. The idea of going to the police with accusations of murder seems surreal, like something from a television show rather than real life. But the evidence David had compiled was substantial, and if Melissa was willing to break into apartments to find it, maybe it was more damning than I'd realized. What would happen if I took the evidence to the police? They'd investigate. Whether they'd find enough evidence to charge her is another question entirely. Melissa is smart and connected, and she's had 3 years to cover her tracks. But at minimum, it would put her under scrutiny and make it much harder for her to try to intimidate you. I spent the rest of that day reading through David's evidence again, this time looking at it from the perspective of a potential criminal case rather than just a personal revelation. The financial records showed that David had been systematically poisoned with small amounts of digitalis over several months before his death. The private investigator had documented Melissa's purchase of foxglove plants, which contained digitalis, and had photographs of her grinding the leaves in her kitchen. There were also recordings of phone conversations where Melissa discussed David's declining health with someone she called Dr. Peterson, conversations that suggested she was monitoring his condition and adjusting her methods based on his symptoms. The most damning evidence was a recording from just 2 weeks before David's death, where Melissa told this Dr. Peterson that it needs to look natural, like a heart attack, and it needs to happen soon. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. More importantly, it painted a picture of premeditated murder, not a crime of passion or opportunity. Melissa had been planning David's death for months, carefully dosing him with poison while playing the loving wife. That evening, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Detective Rodriguez, asking if I could meet with him about additional information related to the break-in at my old apartment. The second was to my supervisor at the hospital, requesting a leave of absence for personal reasons. If I was going to war with Melissa, I needed to do it right. My meeting with Detective Rodriguez took place 3 days later at Phoenix Police Headquarters. I'd brought copies of all of David's evidence, organized in chronological order with a summary I'd written explaining the connections between different documents. Rodriguez was a middle-aged Hispanic man with tired eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd seen enough human cruelty to last several lifetimes. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said after reviewing the documents for over an hour, "this is quite an allegation you're making. You're essentially asking me to investigate your ex-husband's widow for murder based on evidence compiled by the victim himself. I know how it sounds," I admitted, "but the evidence is solid. David was a financial analyst. He knew how to document patterns and build a case based on data. The problem is that most of this evidence was obtained through illegal surveillance. Private investigators can't tap phones or record conversations without consent. Even if we believe your ex-husband was murdered, we might not be able to use any of this in court." I felt my heart sink. "So there's nothing you can do?" "I didn't say that. What I said is that we can't use illegally obtained evidence in a criminal prosecution, but we can use it as a starting point for our own investigation." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. "Tell me about this Dr. Peterson that Mrs. Whitman was talking to in the recordings." "I don't know who he is. David's investigator wasn't able to identify him. We might have better luck with that. If we can find Dr. Peterson and get him to talk, we might be able to build a case against Mrs. Whitman that doesn't rely solely on the surveillance evidence." Rodriguez explained that the investigation would take time, possibly months, and that I shouldn't expect quick results. In the meantime, he advised me to be extremely careful and to report any contact from Melissa or anyone associated with her. "Mrs. Mitchell, if you're right about this woman, she's killed at least 2 people and possibly more. She's not going to hesitate to add you to that list if she thinks you're a threat." I left the police station feeling both hopeful and terrified. Hopeful that justice might finally be served, terrified that I'd just painted a target on my back for a woman who apparently had no qualms about murder. My fears proved justified sooner than I'd expected. The next morning, I found a note taped to my apartment door. "Some secrets are worth dying for. Stop digging or join David." I called Detective Rodriguez immediately, and he sent a patrol car to check on me. The officers took the note as evidence and promised to increase patrols around my building, but they couldn't provide round-the-clock protection based on what amounted to an anonymous threat. "You might want to consider staying with friends or family for a while," one of the officers suggested. at least until we can determine if this threat is credible. The problem was that I didn't have many close friends, and my family lived across the country. David had been my social circle during our marriage, and after the divorce, I'd been too proud and too busy working double shifts to maintain many relationships. I was essentially alone in this fight. That evening, I was researching home security systems on my laptop when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something compelled me to answer. "Sarah, this is Jennifer Walsh from David's firm. We met at the funeral." "I remember. How did you get my number?" David gave it to me along with instructions to call you if anything happened to him. Jennifer's voice was tense, frightened. "Sarah, I think someone's been following me. Ever since the funeral, I've noticed the same car behind me when I drive to work, and yesterday someone tried to break into my apartment." A chill ran down my spine. "Did you call the police?" "Yes, but they said there wasn't enough evidence to do anything. The person didn't actually get inside, and I can't prove I'm being followed." Jennifer paused. "Sarah, David told me that if anything happened to him, you'd be the one person who could expose the truth about his wife. He said you'd have everything you needed to make sure she paid for what she'd done." "What did David tell you about Melissa?" "Enough to know that she's dangerous." "He was scared, Sarah, really scared during those last few months. He said Melissa had figured out that he was investigating her, and he was afraid she'd try to kill him before he could expose her." If David knew she was planning to kill him, why didn't he go to the police himself? He tried, but they wouldn't listen. A man reporting that his wife is trying to poison him sounds like paranoia or a messy divorce, especially when the wife appears to be the perfect grieving spouse. David realized that the only way to expose Melissa was to let her make her move, and then use the evidence he compiled to prove what she'd done. The implication of what Jennifer was saying hit me like a thunderbolt. "Are you telling me that David sacrificed himself to stop Melissa?" I think David realized he was trapped. Melissa had too much power over him, too many ways to destroy his life if he tried to leave or expose her. But he also knew that if she killed him, and if the right person had the right evidence, she could be stopped from killing anyone else. I sat in stunned silence, processing this revelation. David hadn't just left me money and evidence, he'd left me a mission. He'd counted on me to be strong enough, angry enough, and determined enough to see justice done. "Jennifer, are you safe where you are?" "I don't know. I've been staying with my sister across town, but I don't think that's going to be enough if Melissa really wants to silence me." "What do you know that makes you a threat to her?" "I handled David's personal accounts, the ones that Melissa didn't know about. I helped him set up the trust for you, and I know about the money he'd hidden from her. If she's challenged your inheritance, my testimony could prove that David was competent when he made those decisions and that he had legitimate reasons for wanting to provide for you. That explained why Jennifer was being targeted. She was a key witness who could validate David's trust and support any criminal case against Melissa. Jennifer, I think we need to meet. There's something I need to show you." We arranged to meet the next evening at a coffee shop in a busy shopping center, somewhere public where we'd be safe. I spent the rest of that day making copies of David's evidence and preparing to share everything I'd learned with the one person who might be able to help me make sense of it all. The meeting with Jennifer Walsh changed everything. She arrived looking exhausted and frightened, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to be followed. When I showed her David's evidence, her demeanor shifted from fear to grim determination. "I knew David was investigating Melissa, but I had no idea he'd found this much," she said, flipping through the financial records. "Look at these bank transfers. She's been moving money out of accounts David thought were secure." "What do you mean?" "David set up several accounts that were supposed to be secret, money he was saving to start over after he found a way to leave Melissa. But look at these statements. Someone with access to his personal information has been draining those accounts systematically." Jennifer pointed to a series of small withdrawals over the past 6 months, each just under the amount that would trigger automatic bank notifications. This is exactly what she did to her first husband, small, regular withdrawals that looked like legitimate expenses until suddenly the account was empty. How much money are we talking about? Based on what David showed me, probably close to $3 million, money that was supposed to fund his escape from Melissa, money that she's stolen and probably already moved offshore. The scope of Melissa's theft was staggering. She hadn't just killed David, she'd systematically looted his hidden assets while planning his murder. But this revelation also created an opportunity. "Jennifer, if we can prove that Melissa stole money from accounts she wasn't supposed to know about, doesn't that prove she had access to David's private information? Information she could only have got by spying on him." "Exactly. And if she was spying on him, she would have known about his investigation into her background. She would have known he was planning to leave her and expose her." Jennifer's eyes were bright with understanding. "This isn't just evidence of theft, it's evidence of motive for murder." We spent the next 2 hours going through every document, every bank statement, every private investigator report. Jennifer's knowledge of David's finances filled in gaps I hadn't even realized existed, creating a timeline that showed Melissa's increasing desperation as David got closer to exposing her. "Sarah, there's something else," Jennifer said as we prepared to leave. David gave me a safety deposit box key before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you. She handed me a small brass key with a tag showing the name of a bank I'd never heard of. Box 847 at First National Trust on Camelback Road. David said everything you'd need to finish what he started would be in there. I stared at the key, wondering what else David had left for me to find. Did he say what was in the box? Only that it was his insurance policy, his way of making sure Melissa paid for what she'd done, even if she managed to kill him first. The next morning, I drove to First National Trust, a small private bank in an upscale part of Phoenix. The safety deposit box was in the basement vault, accessed through a series of security doors that required both the key and my identification. When the bank employee opened the metal box, I found 3 items inside: a video camera, a laptop computer, and a handwritten note addressed to me. Sarah, the note read, if you're reading this, then Melissa has succeeded in killing me, and you now have the power to make sure she pays for what she's done. The camera contains recordings I made of Melissa discussing her plans with Dr. Peterson. The laptop contains financial records and communications that prove she's been stealing from me for months. Together with the evidence Thomas Bradley has given you, this should be enough to see her convicted of murder and theft. I know I have no right to ask this of you after what I put you through, but you're the only person I trust to see justice done. Melissa destroyed our marriage, stole my life, and she'll do the same to others if she's not stopped. The password for the laptop is Phoenix 2019, the year we should have celebrated our 20th anniversary. Use everything I've left you, Sarah. Make her pay, David. My hands trembled as I opened the laptop and entered the password. The screen came to life, revealing folders full of video files, audio recordings, and documents I'd never seen before. The first video I clicked on showed Melissa in what appeared to be David's home office, talking on her cell phone while she thought she was alone. The digitalis is working perfectly, she was saying to someone off camera. His heart rhythm is becoming increasingly irregular, just like you said it would. How much longer before it looks like a natural heart attack? The voice that responded was male, older, with a slight accent I couldn't place. Another week, maybe 2 at most. The beauty of this method is that even if they do an autopsy, digitalis poisoning can be difficult to detect if the dosing has been gradual enough. It will appear as if his heart simply gave out under stress. Good, I need this finished soon. David's been asking too many questions about our finances, and I think he suspects something if he starts digging too deep. He won't have time to dig anywhere, the voice interrupted. Just maintain the current dosage and be patient. Soon you'll be a very wealthy widow, and no one will ever suspect anything other than a tragic loss. I felt sick watching David's murder being planned so casually, so coldly, but I forced myself to continue viewing the other files. There were dozens of recordings spanning several months, documenting not just Melissa's plot to kill David, but her ongoing theft of his assets and her communications with what appeared to be a network of accomplices. The mysterious Dr. Peterson turned out to be Dr. Marcus Peterson, a disgraced physician who'd lost his medical license for performing illegal euthanasia procedures. The recordings showed Melissa paying him substantial amounts of money for his consultation on David's gradual poisoning. Even more damning, there were discussions about her previous husbands and how their deaths had been arranged. The drowning in Miami was brilliant, Melissa said in one recording, making it look like Robert slipped and fell in the pool while drunk. No one questioned it. That was simpler than the climbing accident in Colorado, Peterson replied. But sometimes the elaborate methods are necessary to avoid patterns. Your late husband David requires the heart attack approach because of his age and stress levels. It fits his profile perfectly. I realized I was listening to 2 serial killers discussing their methods like some kind of macabre business meeting. But what shocked me most was discovering that Melissa and Peterson had been planning their next victim even before David was dead. After this is finished, we move to Seattle, Melissa said in the most recent recording. I've already identified the target, tech executive, recently divorced, substantial assets, and a history of depression that will make suicide believable. This one should be even easier than Phoenix. They were planning to kill again. David's death wasn't the end of their partnership. It was just the next step in a larger pattern of murder for profit. I copied all the files to a secure drive and immediately called Detective Rodriguez. When I told him what I'd found, his response was swift and decisive. Mrs. Mitchell, you need to bring that evidence to the station immediately. And I mean immediately. If what you're describing is accurate, we're not just looking at one murder, we're looking at a serial killing operation. 3 hours later, I was sitting in the Phoenix Police Department's conference room with Detective Rodriguez, his partner Detective Chen, and an FBI agent named Sarah Morrison who specialized in serial killer cases. They'd spent 2 hours reviewing David's evidence, and the atmosphere in the room had grown increasingly tense as the scope of Melissa's crimes became clear. This is one of the most comprehensive cases I've ever seen, Agent Morrison said, closing her laptop. Your ex-husband essentially conducted a professional investigation and documented everything. The video and audio evidence alone would be enough for multiple convictions. What happens now? I asked. Now we arrest Melissa Whitman and Dr. Marcus Peterson, Detective Rodriguez replied. We also coordinate with law enforcement in other states where they may have committed similar crimes. This is going to be a massive investigation. Will I be safe? Agent Morrison's expression was serious. We'll provide protection, but I have to be honest with you, Mrs. Mitchell. People like Melissa don't go quietly. Once she realizes we're closing in, she may try to eliminate witnesses before we can arrest her. As if summoned by those words, my phone began buzzing with an incoming call. The number was blocked, but something told me I should answer. Hello, Sarah. Melissa's voice was calm, almost pleasant, but there was an undercurrent of menace that made my blood run cold. Here you've been busy sharing David's little fairy tales with the police. Detective Rodriguez immediately began tracing the call while Agent Morrison started recording. They're not fairy tales, Melissa. They're evidence of murder. Melissa laughed, a sound completely devoid of warmth. Evidence? You mean the illegally obtained recordings of private conversations, the financial documents that were stolen from my home? I'm afraid none of that will be admissible in court, my dear. The police seem to think otherwise. Police are wrong, but that's beside the point now, isn't it? You've made this personal, Sarah. You've tried to take what's mine, and now you're trying to destroy my life with lies and fabrications. The only lies are the ones you've been telling for years. There was a long pause, and when Melissa spoke again, her voice had dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any shout could have been. David thought he was so clever, leaving you all that evidence, setting up his little revenge from beyond the grave. He made one critical mistake. He assumed you'd be smart enough to stay alive long enough to use it. The line went dead. Detective Rodriguez looked up from his tracing equipment. The call came from a burner phone somewhere in the downtown area, but she could be anywhere by now. We need to move fast, Agent Morrison said, reaching for her radio. Melissa Whitman just made a direct threat against a witness. I'm calling for immediate tactical support. The next 6 hours were a blur of activity. Police units were dispatched to Melissa's house, only to find it empty with signs of hasty departure. Her car was discovered abandoned in the parking garage of Sky Harbor Airport, but security footage showed her leaving in a different vehicle with a man matching Dr. Peterson's description. Meanwhile, I was taken to a safe house on the outskirts of Phoenix, a nondescript ranch home surrounded by plainclothes officers and federal agents. The reality of my situation was beginning to sink in. I was a marked woman being hunted by professional killers who had successfully murdered at least 4 people. But as frightening as the situation was, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: purpose. David had entrusted me with the power to stop Melissa, and despite my fear, I was determined not to let him down. The first break in the case came 18 hours later. Dr. Peterson was arrested trying to board a flight to Mexico City using a false passport. When federal agents searched his luggage, they found enough digitalis concentrate to kill dozens of people, along with detailed notes about methods for inducing heart attacks, strokes, and accidental deaths. Confronted with the evidence and facing multiple federal charges, Peterson agreed to cooperate in exchange for a plea deal. What he revealed made even seasoned law enforcement officers sick to their stomachs. Melissa Whitman had been operating a murder-for-hire scheme for over 15 years. She would identify wealthy targets, usually recently divorced or widowed individuals with substantial assets and limited family connections. Then she would arrange to meet them through dating services, social clubs, or professional networks, always presenting herself as a charming widow looking for love. Once she had established a relationship and gained access to their financial information, she would begin the systematic process of stealing their assets while slowly poisoning them. Peterson provided the medical expertise and the means of death, while Melissa handled the social manipulation and financial theft. David had been victim number 7. 3 more potential victims had been identified in Seattle, Los Angeles, and Denver, people who had been contacted by Melissa in recent months but hadn't yet been targeted for murder. We estimate that she and Peterson have stolen over $50 million and killed at least 8 people, Agent Morrison told me during one of our briefings at the safe house. Your ex-husband's investigation didn't just expose his own murder, it uncovered one of the most successful serial killing operations in modern American history. But Melissa herself remained at large. Despite an international manhunt and alerts at every airport, border crossing, and seaport, she had vanished completely. It was as if she'd simply ceased to exist. Then, exactly 1 week after Peterson's arrest, she resurfaced in the most dramatic way possible. I was reviewing financial documents with Agent Morrison when my secure phone rang. Only law enforcement personnel had this number, so I answered without hesitation. Hello, Sarah. Melissa's voice was as calm and pleasant as ever, but now I could hear the underlying madness more clearly. Missing me, Agent Morrison immediately signaled for the call to be traced while she started recording. Where are you, Melissa? Closer than you think. Tell me, Sarah, how does it feel to be responsible for destroying so many lives? Peterson had a family, children who will grow up knowing their father was a killer because of your vindictive little crusade. Peterson chose to be a killer, just like you did. We provided a service, Sarah. We helped lonely, suffering people find peace while ensuring their assets went to someone who could appreciate them. It was almost charitable, really. The casual way she discussed mass murder was chilling. This wasn't a woman who had been driven to kill by circumstances or passion. This was someone who genuinely believed that other people's lives had no value beyond what could be stolen from them. What do you want, Melissa? I want my life back. I want the $50 million that your investigation has frozen in various accounts. I want Peterson released from federal custody. And I want you to publicly recant your statements and admit that everything you've said about me has been a lie. And if I refuse, then I start killing people you care about one by one until you change your mind. I know where your sister lives in Portland, Sarah. I know where your mother is in that lovely assisted living facility in Tucson. I know the names and addresses of every nurse you've ever worked with. My blood turned to ice. You leave them alone. They have nothing to do with this. They have everything to do with this. You made this personal when you decided to play detective with David's evidence. Now everyone you've ever cared about is going to pay the price for your interference. Agent Morrison was frantically writing notes and making hand signals to other agents in the room. I could see teams mobilizing to protect my family members, but I knew it might not be enough. Melissa had proven she could strike anywhere, anytime. I have a counter-proposal, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Oh, this should be interesting. You want your money and your freedom? Fine. Meet me, just the two of us, and we'll work out a deal. No lawyers, no agents, just a conversation between David's two wives. Agent Morrison was shaking her head frantically, but I continued. The Papago Park overlook tonight at midnight. Come alone and we'll discuss terms. There was a long pause. You're not that stupid, Sarah. This is obviously a trap. Maybe. But it's also your only chance to get what you want without spending the rest of your life running from federal agents. You kill my family and you'll have the entire FBI hunting you forever. But if we make a deal tonight, you could be on a beach in the Cayman Islands by next week. Another pause, longer this time. Papago Park, midnight. If I see even one police officer, one federal agent, one security guard, I disappear forever and your family starts dying. Are we clear? Crystal clear. The line went dead and Agent Morrison immediately exploded. Are you insane? You can't seriously be thinking about meeting with her alone. I don't have a choice. She'll kill innocent people if I don't at least try to negotiate. Sarah, this woman is a serial killer. She's not interested in negotiation. She's interested in eliminating you as a threat. The moment you show up at that overlook, you're dead. I understood the risks, but I also understood something Agent Morrison didn't. Melissa's greatest weakness wasn't her greed or her arrogance. It was her need to be in control. She couldn't resist the opportunity to face me directly, to prove her superiority one final time before ending my life. But I had no intention of giving her that satisfaction. The next 8 hours were spent in intensive planning. Despite their objections, the law enforcement team agreed to support my plan, mainly because it represented their best chance of capturing Melissa alive. The overlook at Papago Park was isolated enough that she might actually show up, but it could also be surrounded by hidden surveillance and tactical teams. Agent Morrison fitted me with multiple recording devices and a GPS tracker that would allow them to monitor my exact location. Sharpshooters would be positioned at strategic points around the overlook, ready to intervene if Melissa threatened my life directly. Remember, Morrison said as we made final preparations, your job is to keep her talking long enough for us to get a clean shot or for her to incriminate herself further. Don't try to be a hero. Don't try to apprehend her yourself. Just survive long enough for us to do our jobs. At 11:45 p.m., I drove my car to the Papago Park overlook, a scenic spot that offered spectacular views of Phoenix during the day but was completely deserted at night. I parked exactly where I'd been instructed and walked to the stone barrier at the edge of the cliff, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it could be heard for miles. At exactly midnight, I heard footsteps behind me. Hello, Sarah. I turned to see Melissa approaching from the parking area, moving with the same elegant grace she'd always possessed. She was dressed in black jeans and a dark sweater, practical clothes that wouldn't stand out in the darkness. Her beautiful face was serene, almost peaceful, as if she were out for a casual evening stroll rather than planning my murder. You came alone, I observed. Did you doubt I would? This is between us now, just two women who loved the same man. She stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to talk normally but far enough to react if I tried anything aggressive. Though I suppose loved isn't the right word for what you felt for David, is it? If you'd really loved him, you wouldn't have let me take him away so easily. David made his own choices. David was weak. He was always weak, even when you were married to him. That's why he needed someone stronger to guide his life, to help him achieve his potential. Melissa's eyes glittered in the moonlight. I made him rich, Sarah. I made him successful. I gave him everything he ever dreamed of having. And then you killed him for it. She laughed, the same cold sound I'd heard on the phone. I liberated him from a life he was too cowardly to live. David knew what I was, Sarah. He knew what I'd done to my previous husbands, and he stayed with me anyway because he enjoyed the benefits of my methods. The money, the status, the excitement of being married to someone dangerous. That's not true, isn't it? Then why didn't he leave me when he found out about my past? Why didn't he go to the police when he suspected I was poisoning him? I'll tell you why, because David was getting exactly what he wanted from our arrangement. He just didn't have the courage to see it through to the end. Her words were designed to hurt me, to make me doubt everything I thought I knew about David and our marriage. But I'd had weeks to process the truth about my ex-husband, and I'd made peace with the complex reality of who he'd been. Maybe you're right, I said. Maybe David was weak. Maybe he did stay with you for selfish reasons. But that doesn't change what you are, Melissa. You're a killer who destroys people for money, and you need to be stopped. Her expression shifted, becoming more calculating. Stopped by whom? You, a bitter ex-wife with delusions of heroism, or perhaps by your friends in law enforcement who are undoubtedly watching us right now despite our agreement. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. I came alone, just like you asked. Of course you did, but they followed you, didn't they? Hidden in the darkness with their long-range microphones and their sniper rifles, waiting for their moment to play hero. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device that looked like a radio. Motion detectors, Sarah, thermal imaging sensors. I've known about your backup team since the moment they took their positions. My heart sank. All the careful planning, all the tactical advantages we thought we'd had, and Melissa had been one step ahead the entire time. So what happens now? I asked. Now you get to choose. You can walk back to your car and drive away, leaving me free to disappear into the night. In exchange, I'll forget about your family and your friends. You'll never see me again, and I'll find other places to continue my work. And if I refuse, Melissa pressed a button on the device in her hand, then everyone dies. The explosives I've planted around this overlook will kill you, me, and every law enforcement officer currently hiding in the rocks. Your heroic gesture will become a mass casualty event, and I'll achieve in death the revenge I couldn't quite manage in life. She was bluffing. She had to be bluffing. But looking into her eyes, seeing the absolute calm with which she discussed mass murder, I realized that Melissa Whitman was far beyond the point where normal logic or self-preservation instincts applied. You're insane, I whispered. I'm practical. I've spent 15 years building a perfect life, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else destroy it. So what's your choice, Sarah? Do you walk away and let everyone live, or do you force me to end this the hard way? In that moment, standing on the edge of a cliff with a madwoman who held the power to kill dozens of people, I realized that David had been right about one thing. I was the only person who could stop her. Not because I was particularly brave or clever, but because I was the only one who understood her well enough to predict her next move. Melissa needed to feel superior. She needed to win, and more than anything, she needed to have the last word. You win, I said, taking a step backward. I'll walk away, just promise me you'll leave my family alone. The smile that spread across her face was triumphant and utterly terrifying. I always win, Sarah. That's what David never understood, and it's what you're just learning now. I am smarter, stronger, and more ruthless than anyone you've ever met. She raised the device in her hand, preparing to detonate the explosives anyway despite my surrender. In her mind, leaving me alive would always represent an unacceptable risk. But as her finger moved toward the detonation button, two things happened simultaneously. First, I dove to the side, rolling behind the stone barrier as Agent Morrison's voice crackled through my hidden earpiece. Charges secured, all devices disarmed, take the shot. Second, the FBI sharpshooter positioned 300 yards away put a tranquilizer dart into Melissa's neck with surgical precision. She looked down at the dart in surprise, then back at me with an expression of pure rage. You, clever, little, she collapsed before she could finish the sentence. The cleanup took another 4 hours. Bomb disposal experts confirmed that Melissa had indeed placed explosives around the overlook, but they were crude devices that Agent Morrison's team had located and disarmed hours earlier using thermal imaging. The motion detectors she'd boasted about were real, but they'd only confirmed what the FBI already knew, that she was armed, dangerous, and willing to kill innocent people to avoid capture. As paramedics loaded the unconscious Melissa into an ambulance for transport to a secure medical facility, Agent Morrison approached me with something resembling admiration in her eyes. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen a civilian do, she said. Probably both, I admitted. My hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off, and I felt emotionally drained in a way I'd never experienced before. For what it's worth, your instincts about her psychology were dead on. She couldn't resist the chance to gloat, and that's what allowed us to get close enough to take her down safely. 3 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse in Phoenix watching Melissa Whitman receive 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Dr. Peterson had received a similar sentence in exchange for his cooperation, but his testimony had been crucial in connecting Melissa to murders in 6 different states. The woman who was led away in shackles bore little resemblance to the elegant socialite who had stolen my husband and destroyed so many lives. 3 months in federal custody had stripped away her carefully maintained facade, revealing the hollow, predatory creature underneath. She looked older, smaller, and utterly defeated. As the judge's gavel fell for the final time, I felt a profound sense of closure that I hadn't expected. David's death had been avenged. Melissa's victims had received justice, and I had survived an ordeal that would have broken many people. But the most surprising part of the entire experience was what I discovered about myself. For years after my divorce, I'd seen myself as a victim, a woman who had been discarded and humiliated by people more powerful and ruthless than I could ever be. The inheritance David left me had been wonderful, but it wasn't the money that changed my life. It was the realization that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. 6 months after Melissa's conviction, I used part of David's inheritance to establish a foundation that provides support for victims of financial fraud and domestic abuse. I also returned to school to complete my medical degree, fulfilling the dream I'd abandoned 15 years earlier to support David's ambitions. The irony wasn't lost on me. David's death had given me the life I'd always wanted but never dared to pursue. I kept one item from David's evidence collection, the note he'd written to me in the safety deposit box. I framed it and hung it in my new office, not as a memorial to our failed marriage, but as a reminder of the power that comes from refusing to let injustice go unpunished. Make her pay, the note concluded, and I had. But more importantly, I'd learned to value myself enough to build a life worth living, independent of anyone else's expectations or limitations. David's final gift wasn't just money or revenge. It was the chance to discover who I really was when I stopped being afraid. 3 years later, Dr. Sarah Mitchell opened her private practice in a renovated building in downtown Phoenix. The waiting room walls were decorated with thank you letters from patients whose lives had been saved, whose illnesses had been caught early, whose pain had been taken seriously by a physician who understood what it meant to fight for justice. On my desk, next to family photos and medical journals, sat a small plaque with a quote that had become my personal motto. The arc of justice is long, but it bends toward those who refuse to give up. Melissa Whitman would spend the rest of her life in a federal prison, forgotten by a world that had moved on without her. Dr. Marcus Peterson had died in custody, apparently of natural causes, though some suspected suicide. And me, I had become exactly the person David always said I could be, if only I had the courage to try. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well enough to prove that you were worth more than your enemies ever realized. Sometimes justice comes not from the courts or the police, but from refusing to let other people's cruelty define the limits of your own potential. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how my ex-husband's death gave me the life I never knew I deserved. It's the story of how $10 million bought me something far more valuable than money, the knowledge that I am strong enough to fight for what's right, smart enough to outmaneuver people who underestimate me, and brave enough to risk everything for justice. David was wrong about many things during our marriage, but he was right about one: I deserved better. I just had to learn to believe it myself.